Why is this history going to be so important to you? The dawn of modesty, when and why humans first started covering their private parts. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more history videos in the future. Imagine, if you will, a vast savanna stretching under a burning African sun more than 170,000 years ago. The air shimmers with heat. A small band of early modern humans, our direct ancestors, moves silently through the tall grass. Their bodies are strong, upright, hairless except for the tops of their heads and a few patches that still carry the ancient sense of survival. They hunt with sharpened stones, gather roots and berries, and huddle together at night against the chill that creeps in after sunset. But something is different about these people compared to every other creature around them. They are beginning to do something no other animal on Earth has ever done in quite the same way. They are starting to cover their most private, vulnerable parts, not just for warmth, not just for protection from thorns and insects, but in a gesture that will one day reshape everything we understand about shame, desire, status, and what it means to be human. This is the story we are about to tell. A full, sweeping documentary journey through time that will take us from the very first tentative strips of animal hide tied around the waist to the complex taboos, fashions, and cultural battles that still define how we dress today. Over the next 2 hours, divided into 10 carefully crafted parts, we will uncover the when, the why, the how, and the astonishing spread of this revolutionary act. We will walk beside our ancestors as they lose their fur, stand upright, and suddenly feel exposed in ways no ape ever had to worry about. We will examine the hard evidence left behind in lice DNA, bone tools, cave floors, and ancient bones. We will ask the uncomfortable questions. Was it cold that forced the first covering? Was it modesty? Was it something far more primal, protection for the very organs that ensured our species' survival? And how did a simple, practical solution in the heart of Africa transform into the global phenomenon of clothing that now fills our closets, our laws, our religions, and even our wars over what should and should not be seen? This history matters because it is the hidden foundation of civilization itself. Without that first decision to cover the genitals, there might never have been the concepts of privacy, eroticism, social hierarchy, or even the idea of nakedness as something shameful. Every skirt, every pair of trousers, every bikini, every religious veil, every fashion trend that has ever existed, all of them trace their roots back to those dusty African plains where someone, for the first time, picked up a piece of softened hide and tied it between their legs. By the end of this 10-part series, you will never look at your own clothes the same way again. You will understand why humans alone among all animals turned vulnerability into virtue, exposure into elegance, and a simple strip of leather into the cornerstone of culture. So settle in, dim the lights if you can. This is a journey that spans hundreds of thousands of years, crosses continents, and dives deep into the most intimate corners of human existence. We begin, as all great human stories must, in Africa, the cradle of our species, around 170,000 years ago. To truly understand the moment when humans first reached for clothing, we have to go even further back, much further. Roughly 1.2 to 2 million years ago, our earlier hominin ancestors began a radical biological experiment. They started losing the thick body hair that had protected every primate before them. Scientists call this the naked ape transition, and it happened for very practical reasons. As our ancestors moved from dense forests into open savannas, they needed better cooling systems. Sweating became their superpower. Hair got in the way of efficient evaporation, so it vanished almost everywhere except the head, where it shielded the brain from the sun, and the pubic and underarm regions, where it still trapped pheromones that helped us find mates in the vast wilderness. But there was a side effect no one could have predicted. Standing upright on 2 legs, another evolutionary leap that happened around the same time, suddenly put the genitals front and center. No longer tucked safely between the hind legs like a quadruped's, the male penis and scrotum, the female vulva, hung exposed to the elements, to sharp grasses, to biting insects, to accidental scrapes during hunts or climbs. In a world full of predators, parasites, and unpredictable weather, this was dangerous. The very organs that carried our genetic future were now vulnerable in ways they had never been. For hundreds of thousands of years, early humans and their close relatives, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, managed with nothing but their own skin. They lived in relatively warm climates. They moved constantly. Full-body fur would have overheated them during the day. But as the climate began to fluctuate, as ice ages loomed and nights grew colder, something had to change. And change it did. The single most powerful piece of scientific evidence for exactly when this happened comes from an unlikely source: lice. Yes, the tiny, blood-sucking parasites that have hitchhiked on humans for millions of years. Head lice and body lice are actually the same species today, but they live in different places. Head lice crawl on hair. Body lice live and lay eggs in clothing. Geneticists studying their DNA have traced the moment when these two populations split. The body louse could only evolve once humans started wearing clothes regularly, creating a new habitat away from the skin. The best estimates, refined through multiple studies, point to a divergence between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. That is our smoking gun. Around 170,000 years ago, during the second to last ice age, anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Africa began putting on simple garments. Not full suits, not tunics, but something minimal, something that covered the parts that needed covering most. This timing is no coincidence. The world was cooling. Glaciers were advancing in the north. Even in Africa, temperatures dropped, winds sharpened, and nights became brutally cold. Our ancestors were already masterful hunters. They killed antelope, zebra, wild cattle. They had stone scrapers, sharp-edged tools designed specifically to clean fat and flesh from animal hides. They had sinew and plant fibers for tying. All the ingredients were there. The only missing piece was the decision: why cover, and why the private parts first? The answer is beautifully practical at the beginning. It was not shame. Shame, as we understand it today, is a cultural invention that would come tens of thousands of years later. In those early days, it was pure survival. A man running through thorn bushes during a hunt could suffer painful injuries to his exposed genitals, cuts that could become infected in a world without antibiotics. A woman gathering food could face irritation, insect bites, or even damage during childbirth preparation. A simple strip of hide passed between the legs and tied at the waist. Today we call it a loincloth or breechcloth, acted like armor for the most delicate areas. It protected without trapping heat during the day. It could be adjusted quickly. And best of all, it was easy to make. Picture the scene. A group has just brought down a small antelope. The men and women gather around the carcass. Using volcanic glass or flint scrapers, they carefully peel away the hide in one piece. They scrape off every bit of fat and membrane, hours of tedious work by the firelight. Then they stretch the skin on the ground, pegged with sticks, and let it dry in the sun until it becomes soft and pliable. No tanning chemicals yet. That technology is still far in the future. They simply chew the edges or rub them with animal brains or fats to keep them supple. Finally, someone takes a narrow strip, perhaps 20 inches long and 6 inches wide, and threads it between the legs. The front hangs down like a modest apron. The back may leave the buttocks exposed or be tucked simply. A belt of twisted grass or leather holds it in place. In one swift motion, vulnerability becomes dignity. Archaeologists have found the tools that prove this process was happening. In Contrabandier's cave on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, scientists uncovered 62 specialized bone tools dated to 120,000 years ago, right at the edge of the last ice age's onset. These were awls and smoothers used to pierce and soften hides from jackals, foxes, wildcats, and other small animals. The climate there was mild, yet people were already processing skins. Why, not just for cloaks against the night chill, but for those intimate, personal coverings that made daily life safer. Similar hide-working tools appear even earlier, 300,000 years ago at Schöningen in Germany, used by Homo heidelbergensis, our close cousins. Bear skins were being turned into wraps. The technology was spreading even before modern humans dominated the scene. But in Africa, among our own lineage, the loincloth became the universal starting point. Why specifically the genitals and not, say, the shoulders or knees? Because those were the parts that hurt most when unprotected. Evolution had left them exposed. Culture simply followed biology. Early humans noticed that wearing even this minimal covering reduced infections, prevented chafing during long marches, and unexpectedly made them feel more confident. A hunter with his genitals shielded could run faster, climb higher, focus on the prey instead of protecting himself. Women carrying infants or gathering could move without constant worry. Over generations, the practice became habitual. Mothers taught daughters how to tie the strip just right. Fathers showed sons the best way to soften the leather so it wouldn't chafe. And here is where the story begins to deepen, because once you cover something, you change how you see it. The very act of hiding the genitals created the concept of private parts. What had been ordinary became special. What had been visible became mysterious. Desire, which had once been openly displayed in the animal world, now required imagination. A glimpse beneath the loincloth became something to seek, something to earn. In that simple piece of hide, the seeds of eroticism were planted, seeds that would one day grow into art, poetry, religion, and entire moral codes. Yet at this stage, 170,000 to 100,000 years ago, there was still no shame. These early coverings were practical, often decorated with beads made from shells or ostrich eggs or painted with ochre for beauty. They signaled skill. I can hunt, I can prepare hides, I am a valuable partner. In warm African climates, many people still went entirely naked above the waist and sometimes below during rituals or hot days. The loincloth was not a prison of modesty, it was a tool of freedom. From the heart of Africa, the practice began to spread. As small bands followed game herds or fled droughts, they carried their knowledge with them. By 100,000 years ago, modern humans were pushing north along the Nile corridor and the Red Sea coast. Some groups reached the Middle East. Others stayed and refined the technique. In southern Africa, at sites like Blombo's cave, we find evidence of ochre processing and shell beads around 75,000 years ago, items that almost certainly adorned clothing. The first coverings were traveling, but the real explosion came around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, when a major wave of Homo sapiens left Africa for good. They carried clothing technology like a superpower. In the colder lands of Europe and Asia, the simple loincloth evolved rapidly. Neanderthals, who had already been living there for hundreds of thousands of years, were probably using similar skin wraps, perhaps even tailored shawls made from bear and deer hides. Genetic evidence suggests they may have invented their own version independently, but when modern humans arrived, the two groups met, traded ideas, and perhaps even interbred while exchanging sewing techniques. By 40,000 years ago, the eyed needle had been invented, first in Siberia, then spreading everywhere. Suddenly, clothing could be fitted, sewn tightly, layered, full trousers, tunics, parkas. The loincloth remained the foundation, the first and last layer closest to the body, but now it supported entire wardrobes. In Europe, during the last glacial maximum around 22,000 years ago, people needed to cover 80 to 90% of their bodies just to survive. Yet even in those freezing caves, the genital covering stayed central. It was never abandoned. Back in Africa, where the climate remained kinder, the loincloth persisted as the dominant form for tens of thousands of years. We see it in the earliest artistic depictions once painting and carving began. We see its descendants in the shanty of ancient Egypt around 3000 BCE, a pleated linen version of the same basic idea. We see it among the Aztecs, the Incas, the indigenous peoples of Australia and the Pacific, right up to modern tribal groups in the Amazon and Papua New Guinea who still wear bark cloth or leaf versions for exactly the same original reasons: protection, comfort, and a sense of readiness. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In part 1, we have only just begun. We have established the biological necessity created by hair loss and bipedalism. We have pinned the date, roughly 170,000 years ago in Africa, through the unbreakable testimony of lice genetics. We have seen the earliest physical evidence in Moroccan bone tools from 120,000 years ago. We have watched our ancestors transform a strip of animal hide into the world's first underwear, and we have understood that the original reason was practical protection, not shame. Yet the moment that first loincloth was tied, something irreversible happened. The The human body was no longer just a body. It became a canvas, a message, a boundary between self and world. The covering of private parts had begun as survival. It would soon become identity. It would become power. It would become taboo. And as our ancestors spread across the globe, carrying this new technology in their hands and on their hips, the story of clothing would explode into countless variations, each one building on that original African invention. How exactly did those first simple strips evolve into the elaborate garments of later civilizations? What role did climate, hunting success, and social competition play in turning protection into ornamentation? And when precisely did modesty, the feeling that it is wrong to be seen, enter the picture? Those questions will take us into the next chapter of this epic tale. But before we pause, remember this. Every time you pull on a pair of underwear, every time you adjust your belt, every time you feel the fabric against your skin, you are participating in a ritual that began 170,000 years ago on a sunlit African plain. You are connected by a single thread of hide and intention to the very first person who ever decided, "Some parts of me are now for me alone." This is only the beginning. The dawn of modesty has just broken. The rest of human history is about to unfold around it. How exactly did those first simple strips evolve into the elaborate garments of later civilizations? The transformation did not happen overnight, but it accelerated the moment our ancestors stepped beyond the familiar warmth of Africa and began their long, perilous trek into the unknown. Around 70,000 years ago, a handful of small bands, perhaps no more than a few hundred people in total, left the African continent through the narrow gateway of the Sinai Peninsula or by hugging the southern coast of the Arabian Peninsula in simple reed boats. They carried everything they owned on their backs: stone tools, fire-making kits, and crucially, the knowledge of how to turn animal skin into that vital strip of protection between the legs. The world they entered was dramatically different. As they pushed northward into the Levant and then deeper into Eurasia, the climate grew harsher with every generation. Winters lasted longer, winds cut like obsidian blades, and the open savanna gave way to dense forests, frozen steppes, and eventually the edge of advancing ice sheets. The original loincloth, so perfectly suited to the African heat, now proved insufficient on its own, yet it never disappeared. Instead, it became the unchanging foundation, the intimate core around which every new layer of clothing would be built. In the biting cold, our ancestors learned to drape larger hides over their shoulders as cloaks, to wrap their legs in separate leggings tied at the waist, and to stitch multiple skins together with sinew thread. But the strip between the legs remained the first thing tied on every morning and the last thing removed at night. It protected the body's most sensitive areas from frostbite, from saddle sores during long marches, and from the chafing of rough outer garments. Archaeological sites from this explosive period of expansion tell the story in silent but unmistakable detail. At Usagizli Cave in southern Turkey, dated to about 45,000 years ago, excavators found thousands of shell beads and pierced animal teeth that once adorned clothing. These were not random decorations. They were carefully arranged along the edges of waistbands and the borders of those simple genital coverings. A hunter returning from a successful kill could now display his prowess not just by the meat he brought back, but by the gleaming ornaments fluttering from his breechcloth as he walked into camp. Status had entered the equation. The practical shield against thorns and cold was becoming a canvas for social signaling. Farther east, in the frozen reaches of Siberia, the technological leap that truly revolutionized clothing appeared around 40,000 years ago. At sites like Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, researchers unearthed the earliest known eyed needles, tiny slivers of bone or ivory with a hole drilled at one end. This was a game changer. Before the eyed needle, garments were simply draped or tied. Now they could be sewn into fitted shapes. Trousers could hug the legs without slipping. Tunics could close at the front. Parkas could be tailored to trap body heat. Yet every reconstruction of these outfits, from the famous 24,000-year-old burials at Sungir in Russia to the 40,000-year-old layers at Koshinki in Ukraine, shows the same pattern. Beneath the beautifully tailored outer layers, the loincloth or breechcloth persisted in its simplest form. Sometimes it was still just a single strip of reindeer hide. Sometimes it had evolved into a more structured pouch sewn from two pieces. But it was always there, guarding the private parts exactly as it had in Africa 130,000 years earlier. Imagine the scene inside a mammoth bone hut on the Russian plain 35,000 years ago. Outside, temperatures hover at -30 degrees Celsius. Inside, a family huddles around a hearth. The father carefully softens a fresh strip of mammoth hide by chewing it. Yes, chewing, until the collagen breaks down and the leather becomes pliable. He threads a sinew cord through holes punched with an awl and ties the strip securely between his legs, adjusting the front flap so it hangs just low enough for Modesty during the day's hunt. His wife, meanwhile, sews tiny ivory beads onto the waistband of her own version, creating a pattern that tells the rest of the band she is a skilled seamstress and a desirable partner. Their children watch and learn. The youngest daughter practices tying her first tiny loincloth on a doll carved from mammoth ivory. In this single domestic moment, the technology is being passed down, refined, and carried forward. As humans spread even farther, the same principle held across vastly different environments. When small groups crossed the land bridge into Australia around 50,000 years ago, the warm climate meant they could return to lighter coverings, bark belts, woven grass skirts, or simple possum skin strips. Yet the genital area remained covered, even when the rest of the body stayed bare. Rock art from Arnhem Land, some of it 28,000 years old, depicts figures wearing precisely these minimal lower garments while hunting or dancing. The same pattern repeated when the first humans reached the Americas between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, trekking across the Bering Land Bridge. In the icy tundra of Alaska and later in the temperate forests of North America, the breechcloth of softened deer or bison hide became standard. Excavations at sites like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania reveal bone awls and hide scrapers identical in function to those used in Africa 150,000 years earlier. Southward, in the lush rainforests of the Amazon basin, indigenous groups that still live traditionally today use the exact same principle. A narrow strip of beaten bark cloth called a tapa or cache sex passed between the legs and tied at the hips. Protection first, ornamentation second, cultural identity always. Climate was the great sculptor of these changes, but hunting success and social competition were the chisels. As our ancestors became more efficient hunters, mastering the spear thrower, the bow, and later the atlatl, they gained access to larger, better quality hides. A single woolly rhinoceros or giant ground sloth provided enough leather for an entire family's wardrobe. With surplus material came experimentation. People began to rub hides with red and yellow ochre, not just to preserve them, but to create striking colors that signaled health and skill. Plant dyes indigo from woad, madder root for crimson, appeared in Eurasia by 30,000 years ago. A beautifully decorated loincloth edged with fox teeth or eagle feathers no longer merely protected. It advertised that its wearer was a successful provider, a desirable mate, a person of note within the group. Social competition, once limited to displays of strength or storytelling around the fire, now found a permanent stage on the human body itself. And yet, through all these innovations, the original purpose never faded. In the bitter cold of the European Ice Age, when people wore layered fur parkas that covered them from neck to ankle, the breechcloth underneath remained the most carefully crafted piece. It prevented chafing where outer seams rubbed, protected against infection in a world where wounds could kill, and crucially, preserved the sense of personal boundary that had begun in Africa. Without that foundational covering, none of the elaborate outer garments would have made sense. The private parts stayed private even as the rest of the body became more and more adorned. This global spread also produced the first hints that something deeper was changing in the human mind. Around 28,000 years ago, in the limestone caves of Western Europe, artists began carving and painting the famous Venus figurines, small stone or ivory women with exaggerated hips, breasts, and bellies. Many of these figures wear carefully depicted belts, strings, or fringed skirts that cover exactly the genital area while leaving the rest of the body naked. The most famous, the Venus of Willendorf, has a twisted cord carved around her waist from which a short, tasseled apron hangs. Scholars once argued these were fertility symbols, but newer analysis shows they are wearing the same style of minimal lower garment that real women of the time actually used. The artists were not imagining nudity. They were showing the cultural norm, private parts covered, everything else optional. The very act of carving these figures suggests that clothing had moved beyond utility. It was now something worth immortalizing in art. By 20,000 years ago, as the last ice age reached its peak, the loincloth had become truly universal. From the frozen mammoth steppes of Siberia to the sun-baked deserts of southern Africa, from the coastal caves of Australia to the high plateaus of the Andes, every human population on Earth had adopted some version of that original African invention. The materials changed: reindeer in the north, kangaroo in Australia, camel in the Middle East, llama in South America. But the design principle remained identical, a strip or pouch covering the genitals, held by a waistband, serving as the irreducible minimum of human dress. And here we reach a subtle but profound turning point. As bands grew larger, as territories became more crowded and resources more contested, the simple act of covering began to carry new emotional weight. A man who lost his loincloth in battle or through misfortune was not just cold or vulnerable. He was diminished in the eyes of others. A woman whose covering slipped during a gathering felt the sting of unwanted attention. What had started as pure protection was quietly acquiring the power to evoke embarrassment. This was not yet the full-blown shame of later civilizations. No laws, no religions, no sermons, but the psychological seed had been planted. The covered body was becoming the normal body. The uncovered private parts were beginning to feel wrong. The Great Migration had done its work. The simple strip of hide had traveled with our species across every continent except Antarctica. It had adapted to ice and jungle, to desert and tundra. It had absorbed beads and dyes, status and beauty. It had survived the invention of sewing, the rise of art, and the first stirrings of social hierarchy. Yet it remained, at its heart, the same practical solution our African ancestors had discovered 170,000 years earlier. But the story was far from over. The real revolution, the moment when protection turned into prohibition, when a useful garment became a moral requirement, still lay thousands of years in the future. That transformation would arrive with the warming climate, the birth of agriculture, and the rise of the first settled villages. As humans stopped wandering and started planting, as populations exploded and strangers became neighbors, the loincloth would evolve once more, this time into something far more powerful than anyone in the Ice Age caves could have imagined. The dawn of modesty was no longer just breaking. It was about to blaze into full daylight. The Great Migration had done its work. The simple strip of hide had traveled with our species across every continent except Antarctica. It had adapted to ice and jungle, to desert and tundra. It had absorbed beads and dyes, status and beauty. It had survived the invention of sewing, the rise of art, and the first stirrings of social hierarchy. Yet it remained, at its heart, the same practical solution our African ancestors had discovered 170,000 years earlier. But the story was far from over. The real revolution, the moment when protection turned into prohibition, when a useful garment became a moral requirement, still lay thousands of years in the future. That transformation would arrive with the warming climate, the birth of agriculture, and the rise of the first settled villages. As humans stopped wandering and started planting, as populations exploded and strangers became neighbors, the loincloth would evolve once more, this time into something far more powerful than anyone in the Ice Age caves could have imagined. The dawn of modesty was no longer just breaking. It was about to blaze into full daylight. Around 12,000 years ago, the last great ice sheets began their slow retreat. Temperatures rose, glaciers melted into rushing rivers, and the vast mammoth steppes of Eurasia gave way to forests, grasslands, and fertile river valleys. In the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and the Levant, wild grains like wheat and barley grew in abundance. For the first time, hunter-gatherers did not have to follow migrating herds across endless plains. They could stay in one place, harvest the same fields season after season, and store surplus food in pits lined with clay or woven baskets. This shift, known today as the Neolithic Revolution, was the single greatest pivot in human history since the control of fire. It turned nomads into villagers, small bands into hundred-strong communities, and episodic scarcity into predictable plenty. With settlement came profound changes in daily life and in clothing. The constant movement that had once limited how much anyone could carry now vanished. People built permanent houses from mud brick, wattle and daub, or stone. They domesticated animals, sheep in the Zagros Mountains around 10,000 BCE, goats shortly after, cattle and pigs in different regions. Wool became available in quantities never seen before. Flax, a plant whose stems yield strong fibers, was cultivated in the Nile Valley in Mesopotamia by 8,000 BCE. The loom, first a simple ground loom, then upright versions, appeared, allowing humans to weave cloth from plant fibers rather than relying solely on scraped hides. The loincloth did not disappear in this new world, it transformed. In the warm climates of the Near East and Mediterranean, linen from flax became the preferred material. It was lighter, more breathable, and could be woven into finer textures than leather. Men continued to wear the basic shenty or kilt-like wrap, a rectangular piece of linen passed between the legs and tied or belted at the waist, often pleated in front for a more elegant drape. This was no longer just protection, it was standardized. In early farming villages like Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements, dating back to 9600 BCE, everyone wore some form of lower covering. Excavations reveal spindle whorls for spinning thread and loom weights, proving textile production was already household industry. Women, meanwhile, began to adopt fuller garments. In many Neolithic sites across Anatolia and the Levant, figurines from 9000–7000 BCE show females wearing skirts or aprons that extend from waist to knee or ankle, often fringed or decorated with incised patterns. These were likely woven flax or wool pieces tied at the hips, covering the genitals and buttocks more comprehensively than the simple strip. The upper body might remain bare or draped with a shawl. Why the change? Settlement brought new social dynamics. Villages grew to populations of several hundred, then thousands. Strangers, people from neighboring hamlets, visited for trade, marriage alliances, or festivals. The intimate familiarity of small hunter-gatherer bands gave way to a world where not everyone knew your body from birth. Exposure carried new risks, judgment, rivalry, unwanted advances. This is where the psychological shift deepened. The original covering had shielded against physical harm, now it shielded against social harm. In growing communities, reputation mattered more than ever. A woman seen gathering water with her lower body uncovered might face gossip that damaged her marriage prospects. A man appearing without his shenty during a communal harvest ritual could be seen as disrespectful or unprepared. The line between normal and indecent began to harden. What had been optional in sparse nomadic life became expected in dense villages. Archaeological evidence supports this gradual layering. At Saddleheruyuk in Turkey, 7500–5700 BCE, one of the largest Neolithic settlements with up to 8,000 inhabitants, wall paintings and figurines depict people in minimal but consistent lower coverings. Men appear in belts or short wraps, women in longer skirts. No full nudity is shown in public scenes. Burials include textile impressions on bones and traces of dyed fibers, suggesting color-coded or status-marked clothing. The famous seated goddess figurines wear elaborate headdresses but maintain covered lower bodies, hinting at emerging gender-specific norms. In Egypt, by 5000 BCE during the pre-dynastic period, the shenty had become emblematic of civilized life. Tomb paintings from later periods retroject this norm backward, but linen fragments and weaving tools from Naqada sites confirm early textile use. The pharaohs and elites would eventually wear elaborate versions, pleated, starched, bleached white to symbolize purity, but the common farmer still relied on the basic loincloth. Covering the private parts was no longer about cold or thorns, it was about being part of society. Nakedness below the waist equated to wildness, to the animal world left behind. This transition from protection to propriety spread unevenly across the globe. In cooler Europe, where farming arrived later, around 6000 BC in the Balkans, 4000 BC in Britain, wool tunics and leggings layered over breechcloths became standard. The famous Iceman Ötzi, frozen around 3300 BC in the Alps, wore a complex outfit, a grass cape, leather belt, fur leggings, and crucially, a leather loincloth beneath it all. Even in death, the genital covering remained. In the Americas, independent domestication of cotton in Peru by 5000 BCE and maize in Mesoamerica led to similar shifts. Andean societies wove cotton into breechcloths and tunics. Maya precursors used bark cloth for cash sexes. In sub-Saharan Africa and Australia, where agriculture developed later or not at all in many regions, minimal coverings persisted longer, but even there, growing villages introduced taboos around full exposure during rituals or in mixed company. The rise of agriculture also amplified gender differences in dress. Men's labor, plowing, herding, often required freedom of movement, so loincloths or short kilts remained practical. Women's roles, gathering, grinding grain, child-rearing, allowed for longer wraps that protected modesty in increasingly public spaces. In many cultures, women's genitals became more stringently covered than men's, perhaps because pregnancy and childbirth made vulnerability more visible, or because patrilineal inheritance emerging in farming societies placed greater emphasis on controlling female sexuality. By 4000 BCE, as the first cities rose, Uruk in Mesopotamia, Hierakonpolis in Egypt, the loincloth had spawned entire wardrobes. Priests wore long robes to signify separation from the profane. Warriors added armor like leather over wraps. Slaves sometimes went minimally clothed to mark status. Covering private parts was now codified. In Sumerian law codes and Egyptian tomb texts, indecency carried penalties. The Bible's later Garden of Eden story, fig leaves as the first shame covering, echoes this Neolithic turning point when humans first felt nakedness as wrong. Yet the transition was never total. In hot climates, men often worked fields bare-chested or entirely minimal. Rituals sometimes required nudity to symbolize return to nature. But the baseline shifted, private parts covered in everyday life. Modesty, once absent, became instinctive. This new era of settled modesty set the stage for everything that followed. Kings in golden kilts, Greek chitons draped just so, Roman togas requiring perfect propriety, medieval chastity belts, Victorian corsets hiding even ankles. The simple strip of hide born for survival had become the anchor of civilization's most intimate rules. But how did these early taboos solidify into religions, laws, and philosophies? How did different cultures interpret the same basic covering in wildly divergent ways? Some embracing nudity in art while forbidding it in streets, others veiling entirely. And what happened when empires collided, forcing one society's modesty onto another's? The answers lie in the Bronze Age and beyond, where clothing became not just habit, but power. The answers lie in the Bronze Age and beyond, where clothing became not just habit, but power. Around 3300 BCE, the world crossed an invisible threshold. In the sun-baked floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates, in the narrow green ribbon of the Nile, and along the Indus River, the first true cities rose: Uruk, Memphis, Mohenjo-Daro. These were not villages of a few thousand souls. They were metropolises of tens of thousands, sometimes more than 100,000 inhabitants. Streets paved with baked brick, ziggurats piercing the sky, granaries the size of small hills, temples staffed by hundreds of priests, palaces guarded by spearmen in bronze helmets. Humanity had invented hierarchy on a scale never seen before. In such places, the meaning of covering private parts changed forever. What began as a practical strip of hide, then a linen shenty signaling civilized belonging, now became one of the most visible markers of rank, role, and moral standing. The same basic garment, still fundamentally a waist-tied covering of the genitals, could communicate everything from slave to king depending on its material, length, decoration, and who was allowed to wear what version. In Sumer, the earliest written records, cuneiform tablets from around 3200 BCE, already refer to specific terms for lower body coverings. The basic male garment was called the konakes in its elaborate form, a woolen or linen skirt with tiered fringes mimicking sheep fleece, but beneath it or in simpler daily wear remained the tug 2-bar dul 5, essentially a wrapped or tied loincloth. Common laborers and farmers wore plain versions of undyed wool or coarse linen, tied simply between the legs and secured with a cord belt. Priests and high officials wore longer, pleated versions reaching to the ankle or mid-calf, often bleached white or dyed with expensive madder red or indigo. The length itself became symbolic. The longer the covering extended downward, the higher the status, because it signaled you did not need to squat in fields or wade through irrigation canals. Kings and gods in cylinder seals and statues are shown in voluminous, multi-layered kilts that completely obscure the legs while still preserving the original principle of a front apron or wrap over the genitals. Women's dress followed a parallel but stricter logic. In early Sumerian art, high-status females appear in long cloaks or robes that drape from shoulder to ankle, but depictions of servants and dancers show shorter tunics or skirts that still cover the pubic area fully. By the time of the Akkadian Empire, c. 2334–2154 BCE, legal texts begin to mention penalties for uncovering oneself in public, particularly for women. A tablet from Nippur records a case where a woman was fined for appearing in the marketplace with her lower garment improperly arranged, exposing what should not be seen. This is one of the earliest written indications that covering private parts had become not merely customary but legally and morally obligatory. Egypt took this codification even further. By the Old Kingdom, c. 2686–2181 BCE, the male shenty had become a national uniform. Wall paintings in mastaba tombs show every class of man, from pharaoh to boatman, wearing the same basic triangular linen apron passed between the legs and knotted at the back or side, with the front panel hanging to mid-thigh or knee. The differences lay in quality and accessories. The king's shenty might be starched, pleated into razor-sharp folds, embroidered with gold thread, and worn with a bull's tail attached at the back as a symbol of virility. A noble's version would be finely pleated and belted with a jeweled girdle. A peasant's would be coarse, knee-length, and frequently hitched up during labor. Yet no adult male Egyptian of any rank is depicted without it in public or ritual scenes. Even in depictions of manual labor, harvesting, fishing, building, the shenty stays in place. For women, the shift was more dramatic. In the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, elite women sometimes appear bare-breasted with only a hip wrap or none at all below the waist in ceremonial contexts. By the Fourth Dynasty, however, full-body sheaths of transparent linen became standard for high-status females. These clinging dresses reached the ankles and were held by shoulder straps, effectively covering the entire torso and genitals in a single garment. Lower-class women and servants continued wearing simpler wrap skirts or just a beaded girdle with a frontal apron, still covering the private parts but leaving the breasts exposed. The message was clear: the more fabric and the more layers, the higher the rank and the greater the requirement for modesty. This was not arbitrary fashion. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, the covering of genitals became tied to concepts of purity, order, and divine approval. Temples required ritual ablutions and specific dress codes. Priests shaved their bodies and wore pure white linen loincloths to symbolize removal of all impurity. To appear uncovered in sacred space was to invite chaos. Ma'at in Egypt, the cosmic order that kept the Nile flooding and the sun rising. The genitals as the source of life and therefore of potential disorder, birth, sex, menstruation, had to be controlled and hidden to maintain harmony. Across the Indus Valley Civilization, c. 3300–1300 BCE, the pattern repeats with local variations. Terracotta figurines from Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa show women wearing short wrap skirts or girdles with frontal panels, often decorated with beads or stamped patterns. Men appear in similar lower wraps. The famous priest-king statue wears a cloak over one shoulder but a clearly defined waist cloth beneath. Cotton, domesticated here earlier than anywhere else, allowed finer weaves and more comfortable coverings in the hot climate. Yet seals and figurines never show complete genital exposure in adult figures. Only children or certain ritual performers appear naked. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, with its watertight brickwork and changing rooms, suggests public bathing rituals where modesty coverings were likely removed only in segregated or controlled settings. Meanwhile, in East Asia, the independent development of sericulture, silk production, around 3000 BCE in the Yellow River Valley gave rise to wrapped robes and trousers. The earliest evidence from sites like Hemudu shows people wearing stitched lower garments, early trousers or leggings tied at the waist over a basic breechcloth-like wrap. By the Shang dynasty, c. 1610–46 BCE, oracle bones mention specific terms for lower garment and punishments for improper dress at court. Covering the private parts had become part of ritual propriety, the glue holding society together. These Bronze Age civilizations did not invent modesty. They inherited it from the Neolithic, but they turned it into an instrument of control. Laws began to specify who could wear what. In Hammurabi's Code, c. 1750 BCE, several clauses deal with clothing as evidence of status or wrongdoing. A man who uncovers a woman's body without consent faces severe penalties. A wife who appears improperly dressed can be divorced without dowry return. Clothing, and especially the covering of genitals, became legal tender in the marketplace of reputation and power. Religion amplified this. In Mesopotamia, the goddess Inanna/Ishtar was both patron of love and war. Her myths include episodes of deliberate undressing to enter the underworld, symbolizing vulnerability and loss of power. Yet in temple cults, priestesses wore elaborate layered garments that concealed while hinting. The tension between erotic power and required concealment became a permanent feature of human culture. By the Late Bronze Age, c. 1600–1200 BCE, as trade networks linked Egypt, Mycenaean Greece, Hittite Anatolia, and the Levant, ideas about covering spread rapidly. Minoan frescoes from Crete show women in flounced skirts and bare breasts, still covering genitals but displaying upper bodies boldly. Mycenaean warriors wore loincloths under armor. The collision of these traditions would set the stage for the classical world. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of this era was the emergence of gendered modesty as a near-universal norm. Men's coverings often remained shorter and more functional. Women's became longer, more concealing, more policed. The original practical reason, protection, faded into the background. What remained was the idea that certain parts of the body must be hidden to preserve social order, personal honor, and divine favor. As the Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BCE, cities burned, trade routes severed, writing systems disrupted, the basic technology of the loincloth and its descendants survived. Survivors carried the knowledge forward into the Iron Age, where new empires would reinterpret the same ancient gesture in even more elaborate ways. The next chapter belongs to Greece and Rome, to Confucius and the Vedic priests, to the moment when philosophers, poets, and lawmakers turned the covering of private parts into the cornerstone of virtue, citizenship, and civilization itself. We step now into the Iron Age Mediterranean, roughly 1200–300 BCE, where two very different but ultimately intertwined visions of the human body and its concealment took root. In the rocky hills and island archipelagos of what we now call Greece, a culture emerged that would spend centuries arguing, with paintbrushes, marble chisels, tragic choruses, and philosophical treatises. about exactly how much of the body should be seen, by whom, and under what circumstances. The Greeks did not invent the loincloth, they inherited and refined it. Mycenaean warriors of the late Bronze Age had worn short leather or linen wraps under their bronze armor. When the so-called Dark Ages lifted around 900 BCE, and the geometric style gave way to the Orientalizing and then archaic periods, the perizoma, the Greek term for the fundamental genital covering, became ubiquitous in daily life and sport. Vase paintings from the 8th and 7th centuries BCE show athletes, hunters, and laborers wearing nothing else. A simple strip of wool or linen passed between the legs, knotted or pinned at the hips, with a short frontal apron or sometimes just a pouch that cupped the genitals. In the searing heat of the Peloponnese or the Aegean Islands, this minimal garment made perfect sense. It allowed full range of motion for running, wrestling, jumping. It wicked sweat. It dried quickly after sea swims or river baths, but the Greek innovation was not the garment itself, it was the context in which it could be removed. By the 6th century BCE, public nudity for adult male citizens during athletic contests had become not just accepted but celebrated. The gymnasium, literally placed to train naked, institutionalized this practice. Young men oiled their bodies, scraped off sweat and dirt with strigils, and competed in foot races, pancration, discus, and javelin entirely without clothing. The perizoma was worn to and from the gymnasium or during preliminary warm-ups but discarded for the actual events. Women were excluded from these spaces, female athletes, the rare exceptions, such as at the Heria festival in Olympia, wore short chitons. Why did Greek men feel comfortable exposing their genitals in public while insisting on covering them in most other contexts? The answer lies in a profound cultural distinction between the civic noble nude and the shameful or servile nude. A freeborn Greek citizen stripping in the gymnasium displayed airy excellence, kallikagathia, the union of beauty and goodness, and self-mastery. His nudity was heroic, echoing the nakedness of gods and mythic heroes on pottery and temple friezes. But the same man appearing naked in the agora, at a symposium, or before his social superiors would have invited ridicule or legal consequences. Slaves, foreigners, and women who appeared publicly naked were shamed precisely because their nudity lacked the civic context that sanctified it. Philosophers sharpened this ambivalence into doctrine. Plato in the Republic casually proposes that female guardians should train naked alongside men, arguing that custom, not nature, dictates shame over exposed genitals. Yet even he acknowledges the force of habit. People would laugh at first, then grow accustomed. Aristotle, more conservative, ties modesty eidos to the lower body specifically. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he notes that humans feel shame most acutely about those parts concerned with generation and excretion. The genitals are not merely private, they are the seat of appetites that reason must govern. To cover them in ordinary life is to signal self-control. To uncover them outside sanctioned settings is to surrender to animal impulse. Greek art immortalized this tension. The famous Kouroi statues of the archaic period show nude youth standing in rigid frontal poses, genitals prominently carved yet stylized, small, unerect, almost decorative. By the classical period, 5th–4th centuries BCE, sculptors like Polykleitos and Praxiteles introduced contrapposto and naturalistic proportions, but the genitals remained modest in scale and never aroused. The small, limp penis became the visual code for civilized restraint. Large or erect members were reserved for satyrs, priapus figures, or comic grotesques. Even Aphrodite, when depicted nude, as in the Cnidian type of Praxiteles, c. 350 BCE, instinctively covers her pubic area with one hand, a gesture that paradoxically draws attention to what it conceals. Rome inherited this Greek gymnasium culture, but reshaped it to fit a far more hierarchical, militaristic, and legalistic society. Roman men of the Republic, 509–27 BCE, wore the subligaculum, a sewn or wrapped linen breechcloth under the tunic in daily life and under armor in war. Soldiers on campaign sometimes fought stripped to the waist but kept the subligaculum. In the public baths thermae, nudity was standard for men, but again context mattered. Mixed bathing was occasional and controversial. Separate hours or sections for women preserved a baseline of gendered modesty. Roman law codified what Greeks had only debated. The 12 Tables, c. 450 BCE, already penalized certain public exposures. By the late Republic and early Empire, the Lex Iulia de Adulteriis Coercendis, 18 BCE, treated improper undressing as evidence of intent to commit adultery. A woman who appeared in public with insufficient covering below the waist could be accused of stuprum, sexual dishonor. Elite Roman women wore the stola, a long, voluminous dress reaching the ankles over a subligaculum and often a breastband mammillary. The more fabric, the higher the social rank and the stricter the expectation of concealment. Yet Rome also preserved spaces of sanctioned nudity. Gladiators fought nearly naked, wearing only a loincloth, subligaculum, and greaves. Charioteers in the Circus Maximus raced in short tunics or just breechcloths. These were exceptions carved out for spectacle and danger, much like the Greek athletic nude, but they never extended to ordinary citizens in ordinary settings. The Emperor Augustus, in his program of moral renewal, famously tried to limit public nudity and reinforce traditional dress codes, even while patronizing Greek-style athletic festivals. Far to the east, two other great Iron Age civilizations were writing their own chapters in the same story. In northern India, the Vedic period, c. 1500–500 BCE, and the rise of the early kingdoms saw the loincloth evolve into the kopina for men, a narrow strip of cotton or bark cloth passed between the legs and tied at the hips, and the S. A. Macron letter 1E5B I Macron precursor for women, a single long piece of cloth draped and tucked to cover from waist to ankle. The Rigveda and later Dharmasastra texts emphasize purity, sauka, and decorum in dress. Exposing the genitals outside ritual contexts, where certain ascetics deliberately went naked to renounce worldly shame, was considered a lapse in Dharma. The laws of Manu, c. 200 BCE 200 CE, prescribe specific coverings for different castes. Brahmins wear longer, finer cloths, lower castes shorter and coarser ones. Covering private parts became a visible index of via R letter 1E47, a social class and spiritual discipline. In China, during the Eastern Zhou and Warring States period, 770–221 BCE, the basic lower garment was the ku, trousers or leggings, worn over a shoe, a simple wrap or pouch-like covering of the genitals, itself tied under a broad belt. Confucian thinkers elevated this practical covering into a symbol of ritual propriety, lei. The Analects records Confucius insisting that the superior man is careful even in his private chamber, implying that modesty begins at home and extends outward. The Book of Rites details exact specifications. Men's garments must not ride up during bowing. Women's must fully conceal the body below the neck in mixed company. By the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, silk trousers, robes, and underwraps had become standardized across classes, with sumptuary laws forbidding commoners from wearing certain colors or fabrics that elites used to signal their superior modesty and refinement. Across these four great classical civilizations, Greece, Rome, India, China, the covering of private parts had completed its transformation from survival technology to moral technology. It no longer merely protected flesh from sun, cold, thorns, or chafing. It protected society from disorder, individuals from shame, and the soul, or dharma, or cosmic harmony, from pollution. Philosophers disagreed on details. Plato flirted with co-ed nudity. Diogenes the Cynic rejected clothing altogether to prove self-sufficiency. Indian sadhus practiced sky-clad asceticism. But the baseline consensus was overwhelming. Adult genitals belong out of sight in ordinary social space. This classical consensus would prove astonishingly durable. When Alexander's armies reached the Indus in 326 BCE, Greek observers were shocked by Indian gymnosophists, naked sages, yet recognized the same underlying logic. Nudity could be a statement of transcendence precisely because covering was the default rule. When Rome absorbed Hellenistic kingdoms, it absorbed Greek athletic nudity, but never let it erode the Roman emphasis on clothed dignity in civic life. The same tension between heroic nudity and everyday modesty would echo through the European Middle Ages, the Islamic world, and beyond. Yet cracks were already appearing. In the Hellenistic kingdoms after Alexander and later under Roman imperial luxury, elite women began experimenting with more transparent silks and daring drapery that hinted at the body beneath. In India, the rise of devotional bhakti movements would eventually produce temple sculptures of voluptuous goddesses whose clinging garments left little to the imagination, yet still covered the critical triangle. The dialectic between concealment and revelation, shame and allure, had been set in motion. It would never stop. As the classical world gave way to new religious empires, Christianity sweeping the Mediterranean, Buddhism and later Islam spreading across Asia, the ancient strip of hide would be reinterpreted yet again, this time through the lens of sin, purity, paradise, and divine command. We begin in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century CE, where a small Jewish sect centered on a carpenter from Nazareth began to spread teachings that would, within 3 centuries, become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Christianity did not arrive with a new wardrobe. It inherited the Roman sublegaculum, the Greek perizoma, the Jewish tallit and undergarments, and the broader Near Eastern tradition of covering the genitals as a baseline of decency. What Christianity brought was an intensified theological framework that turned that baseline into a cosmic imperative. The pivotal text appears early in the opening chapters of Genesis. The story of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil ends with a sudden, irreversible awareness. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Genesis 3:7. Before the fall, nakedness carried no shame. After it, covering the private parts becomes humanity's first spontaneous act of self-conscious modesty. God does not command the covering, Adam and Eve do it themselves, but God later provides them with garments of skins, 3:21, replacing the makeshift fig leaves with something more durable. The implication is clear and has echoed through 2 millennia of Christian thought. Nakedness below the waist is now tied to sin, vulnerability, and the rupture between humanity and God. Covering is not merely practical or social, it is reparative. Early Christian communities in the Roman world lived this theology in everyday dress. Men continued wearing the sublegaculum under tunics. Women wore the strophium, breastband, and subliger, a form of loincloth or shorts like wrap beneath long tunics or the palla. But new emphases emerged. Paul's letters already urge modesty in apparel. Women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire. 1 Timothy 2:9. While the passage focuses on ostentation, later interpreters extended it to bodily exposure. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE in North Africa, railed against women wearing transparent silks or short hems that revealed legs or hinted at the outline of genitals beneath fabric. For him, the veil and long garments were not fashion but armor against lust, both one's own and others. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE and Theodosius made it the state religion in 380 CE, the Church had developed a consistent position. The genitals must be covered at all times in public and increasingly, even in private. Monastic rules such as those of Pachomius in Egypt, c. 320 CE, and later Benedict in the West, c. 530 CE, required monks and nuns to sleep in their tunics and never remove undergarments except for necessary washing. Nudity was permitted only for ritual baptism, where candidates were immersed naked to symbolize rebirth, and in medical contexts, but even then, strict segregation by sex was enforced. In the Byzantine Empire, which carried Roman and Christian traditions eastward after the fall of the Western Empire in 476 CE, this modesty regime became visually spectacular. Imperial mosaics in Ravenna and Constantinople show emperors and empresses in long, heavily embroidered robes that reach the floor, layered over under tunics and loin wraps. Empress Theodora, d. 548 CE, is depicted in San Vito wearing a dalmatic and palace so voluminous that no hint of body contour appears below the waist. The message was theological as much as political. The closer one stood to divine authority, the more completely the private parts, and indeed the entire sexualized body, must disappear beneath fabric symbolizing purity and order. Simultaneously, in the Arabian Peninsula, a new revelation was unfolding that would carry the logic of genital covering to an even stricter plane. The Qur'an, revealed to Muhammad between 610 and 632 CE, contains explicit instructions on dress that build directly on Jewish and Christian precedents while adding distinctive elements. Surah Nur 24:30-31 commands believing men and women to lower their gaze and guard their private parts, and instructs women to draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their adornments except to close family. The term for private parts here, furuj, is broad but centers on genitals. Surah Al-Ahzab 33:59 further directs the Prophet's wives, daughters, and believing women to draw their outer garments around them, when outside so they may be recognized as virtuous and not harassed. The resulting garment, the jilbab or kimmer, evolved into various regional forms, but the underlying principle remained absolute. The aura, the parts of the body that must be covered, for men includes everything between the navel and knee, with disagreement on whether the navel and knee themselves are included, while for women it encompasses the entire body except face and hands, with some schools extending to face veil or niqab. In practice, early Muslim men wore the izar, a waist-to-ankle wrap similar to the ancient shenti and rida upper cloak. Women wore long tunics and headscarves that draped over the chest and hips. Genital covering was non-negotiable. Even in the hot climate of Mecca and Medina, the minimum remained a secure lower wrap. The rapid Islamic conquests, 630–750 CE, spread this dress code across 3 continents. In Umayyad and Abbasid cities, Damascus, Baghdad, Cordoba, tailors produced finely woven cotton, linen, and silk versions of the required garments. Sumptuary laws distinguished Muslims from dhimmis, protected non-Muslims, partly through dress. Christians and Jews were sometimes required to wear distinctive belts or colors, but all were expected to cover genitals according to their own traditions. The hammam, public bath, preserved a space for nudity, but strict gender segregation and immediate covering upon exit maintained modesty outside. In the medieval Christian West, meanwhile, the Church's control over dress intensified after the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century. Canon law increasingly treated improper exposure as a sin against chastity. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, mandated that Jews and Muslims wear distinguishing clothing partly to prevent sexual mixing, but the same councils urged Christian women to wear long gowns and men to avoid short tunics that revealed too much leg. The rise of the cult of the Virgin Mary reinforced the ideal of total female concealment below the neck. By the 13th–14th centuries, European women of all classes wore layered gowns, chemises, and underdrawers, early forms of women's loincloth-like shorts that reached mid-thigh or knee. Men wore brays, loose linen drawers, beneath hose or chausse. The Crusades, 1095–1291, created direct contact between these worlds. Frankish knights in the Levant adopted lighter cotton undergarments from Muslim tailors, while Muslim chroniclers noted with surprise and occasional admiration the relative simplicity of Christian covering norms compared to Islamic strictness. Yet both civilizations agreed on the core: private parts must never be publicly visible. In South Asia, the arrival of Islam from the 8th century onward layered new expectations onto existing Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Mughal miniature paintings from the 16th–17th centuries show Hindu men in dhotis, long loincloth-style wraps, and Muslim men in pajama or lungi beneath tunics, both securely covering genitals. Women's gagra choli or sari continued to drape modestly over hips and legs. The shared cultural space produced hybrid forms. The salwar kameez, which combined Persian trousers with Indian tunic, became widespread partly because it offered excellent coverage of the lower body. In sub-Saharan Africa, where Islam spread via trans-Saharan trade from the 8th century, local bark cloth and woven cotton loincloths merged with introduced wrappers and head ties. In West African kingdoms like Mali and Songhai, men of status wore elaborate boubous over secure under wraps. Women adopted voluminous wrappers that covered from chest to ankle. By the late medieval period, the world's major religious traditions had converged on a shared moral architecture. The genitals are the most potent site of shame and temptation. Covering them is a religious duty. Failure to do so risks divine displeasure, social disorder, and personal damnation. Variations existed. Some traditions permitted ritual nudity, certain Hindu ascetics, early Christian baptism, Sufi dervishes in ecstatic states, but these were exceptions carved out against the norm. The Renaissance and Reformation would soon challenge parts of this consensus. Humanist scholars rediscovered Greek athletic nudity in ancient texts and statues. Protestant reformers criticized Catholic clerical dress as ostentatious while still insisting on bodily modesty. Artists like Michelangelo carved David, 1504, with genitals fully exposed yet idealized. Yet even these rebellions occurred within a framework that assumed everyday covering. The loincloth's distant descendant, underwear, remained mandatory. As Europe entered the early modern era, colonial expansion would carry these intertwined Christian-Islamic modesty codes to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, often clashing with indigenous minimal dress traditions and forcing new syntheses. As Europe entered the early modern era, colonial expansion would carry these intertwined Christian-Islamic modesty codes to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, often clashing with indigenous minimal dress traditions and forcing new syntheses. We now cross into the 15th through 19th centuries, a period when the ancient gesture of tying a strip of hide around the waist would encounter gunpowder empires, transatlantic slave ships, steam-powered textile mills, Protestant moral crusades, and the first stirrings of global fashion. This is the era when covering private parts stopped being primarily a religious or survival imperative and became, for many of the world's most powerful societies, the very definition of civilization itself. The story accelerates in 1492, when Christopher Columbus's ships made landfall in the Caribbean. The Taino people who greeted them on the beaches of Hispaniola wore almost nothing. Men a simple cotton or bark cloth cache sex, a small frontal apron or pouch tied at the hips. Women often just a cotton belt or nothing at all below the waist in everyday life, with more elaborate aprons for ceremonies. Similar minimal coverings prevailed across much of the Americas. Feather belts among the Aztecs, cotton maxtlatl loincloths among the Maya and later Nahua, tapa beaten bark strips in Polynesia and parts of South America, animal hide breechcloths among Plains and Amazonian groups. These were direct descendants of the 170,000-year-old African original, practical, climate-appropriate, often decorated, but leaving most of the body exposed. To European eyes, this was not simplicity, it was barbarism. Spanish chroniclers described indigenous peoples as naked savages, bestial, without shame. The phrase sin vergüenza, without shame, became a standard descriptor. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who would become the first major European critic of colonial brutality, still accepted the premise. Indigenous nudity proved their lack of true religion and civilization. The solution, in the eyes of conquistadors, missionaries, and crown officials, was immediate and total. Force the covering of genitals as the first step toward conversion and subjugation. In Mexico, after the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, Franciscan and Dominican friars distributed coarse cotton tunics and trousers to indigenous men, insisting they abandon the maxtlatl. Women were given huipiles and enredos, wrapped skirts that reached the ankles. Refusal could mean public flogging or exclusion from the new Christian communities. In the Andes, the Spanish encountered Inca men wearing the chupa, short tunic, over a simple breechcloth. They replaced it with European-style breeches and doublets. In Brazil, Portuguese Jesuits in the 16th century compelled Tupi-Guarani converts to wear cotton wraps or linen shorts, declaring that the devil delights in nakedness. Across the continent, missions became clothing factories, spinning, weaving, sewing, where indigenous labor produced the very garments that symbolized their submission. The transatlantic slave trade amplified this dynamic on a horrifying scale. Between 1501 and 1866, roughly 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. Many came from West and Central African societies, where men wore loincloths of cotton, raffia, or leather, and women wore wrappers or short skirts, modest by local standards but far less concealing than European norms. Enslaved people arrived on plantations wearing only what they had been allowed to keep or what was issued, often nothing at all during the Middle Passage, then rough Osnaburg or burlap loincloths or shifts on arrival. Planters and overseers used clothing or its absence as an instrument of control. In the U.S. South, enslaved men frequently worked fields in only a breechcloth or short shirt, women in shifts that reached mid-thigh. Laws in Virginia 1705 and South Carolina 1740 prohibited enslaved people from wearing anything finer than Negro cloth, and some masters deliberately kept coverings minimal to humiliate and sexualize their human property. Yet enslaved communities resisted and adapted. Women sewed hidden pockets into skirts, men tied scraps into more dignified wraps when possible. After emancipation in 1865, one of the first acts for many freed people was to acquire proper clothing, long dresses for women, trousers for men, as a declaration of reclaimed humanity and modesty. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation were reshaping modesty from within. Protestant reformers like John Calvin condemned Catholic clerical vestments as papist pomp, but doubled down on lay modesty. In Geneva, sumptuary laws fined women for low necklines or short hems that revealed legs above the ankle. Puritans in England and New England wore sober black and gray, with women in long gowns and men in breeches over linen drawers, underwear now standardized as a moral necessity. The Geneva Bible's marginal notes on Genesis 3 emphasized that fig leaves were inadequate. Only God-given garments, interpreted as proper Christian dress, sufficed. The Catholic response was equally emphatic. The Council of Trent, 1545-1563, reaffirmed the need for clerical and lay modesty. In Spain and its colonies, the Inquisition policed dress. Women caught in indecent, low-cut bodices or transparent fabrics faced public penance. The rise of the chemise and petticoat in the 16th century gave women layered undergarments that fully covered the genitals and buttocks, even if outer skirts were lifted by wind or work. By the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution transformed the material basis of all this. Water-powered spinning jennies and power looms flooded markets with cheap cotton from slave-worked plantations in the American South and India. Suddenly, underwear became affordable for the masses. In Britain, by 1800, working-class men routinely wore linen or cotton drawers. Women adopted the chemise and split drawers, early crotchless or open crotch undergarments that allowed bathroom functions without full undressing. The private parts were now covered by factory-made fabric at every social level. The Victorian era, 1837–1901, crystallized this into an almost pathological obsession with concealment. Queen Victoria's court set the tone. Ankles must never be shown, even at the beach. Bathing machines rolled into the sea so women could enter the water fully covered. Men's trousers replaced breeches, fully enclosing the legs and genitals in a way that earlier centuries would have found constricting. Women's crinolines, bustles, and corsets created an hourglass silhouette while burying the lower body under multiple petticoats. Drawers became mandatory. Falling or showing leg was scandalous. This Victorian code was exported through empire. In India, British administrators viewed the dhoti and sari as immodest because they draped rather than tailored. They pushed trousers and blouses for men and respectable covered dresses for women in mission schools. In Africa, colonial officers and missionaries condemned bare breasts and minimal loincloths as heathen. Converts were issued European-style clothing. In the Pacific, Hawaiian missionaries forced muumuu-like dresses on native Hawaiians to cover what had previously been bare. The phrase civilizing mission almost always included forced or strongly encouraged covering of private parts according to Western Christian standards, yet resistance and syncretism were constant. In Meiji Japan 1868–1912, the government initially promoted Western dress, including trousers and drawers, to signal modernity, but many Japanese retained traditional fundoshi, loincloth, underneath. In colonial West Africa, educated elites adopted European suits while keeping local wrappers for home. Women blended Victorian blouses with vibrant printed cloth wraps. In the Caribbean, formerly enslaved populations created carnival costumes that playfully exaggerated and then subverted European modesty norms, revealing yet costumed, covered yet defiant. By the late 19th century, the first cracks in Victorian absolutism appeared. The bicycle craze of the 1890s forced women into bloomers, baggy trousers under skirts, so they could ride without exposing ankles or undergarments. Early feminists like the Rational Dress Society argued that corsets and heavy skirts were unhealthy and oppressive. Bloomers and shorter skirts gained ground. In art, the Impressionists and later the Post-Impressionists began painting nudes with a frankness that challenged academic modesty. Photography, especially the postcard nude, brought images of uncovered bodies into private hands, eroding the monopoly of religious and state control over what could be seen. The 20th century would accelerate these fractures into open warfare, swimwear shrinking from full-body woolen costumes to bikinis, underwear evolving from heavy drawers to briefs and thongs, feminism questioning whether covering was liberation or oppression, religious revival movements insisting on ever stricter veiling, global media spreading competing images of the body. The original practical loincloth had spawned an astonishing diversity of meanings: hygiene, fashion, sexuality, identity, resistance, submission, piety, rebellion. But before we reach those modern battlegrounds, we must first trace how the early 20th century turned underwear from hidden necessity into visible statement, how 2 world wars and decolonization reshaped global modesty norms, and how the late 20th and early 21st centuries produced the paradox we live with today: unprecedented exposure in media alongside renewed religious and cultural insistence on covering private parts. The story now approaches the present, where the 170,000-year-old decision to cover is still being debated, redesigned, politicized, and reinterpreted every single day. The story now approaches the present, where the 170,000-year-old decision to cover is still being debated, redesigned, politicized, and reinterpreted every single day. We enter the 20th century at full speed. The year is 1900, and the silhouette of modesty is still unmistakably Victorian. Women encased in corsets, petticoats, chemises, and drawers that reach below the knee. Men in 3-piece suits, vests, long johns beneath trousers. Underwear exists, but it is heavy, utilitarian, and almost never discussed in polite society. The private parts remain the most rigorously concealed region of the body, hidden beneath multiple layers even in the heat of summer. Yet beneath this surface calm, forces are gathering that will, within a few short decades, shrink those layers dramatically, expose more skin than any previous generation thought possible in public, and turn the ancient act of covering genitals into one of the most contested cultural battlegrounds of modern times. The first visible tremor comes with the bicycle and the new woman. By 1895–1910, middle-class women in Europe and North America begin riding safety bicycles in large numbers. Long skirts catch in chains and spokes, corsets restrict breathing during exertion. The rational dress movement, led by figures like Amelia Bloomer, whose name became synonymous with the garment she popularized in the 1850s but which only gained widespread traction later, pushes for bloomers, baggy Turkish-style trousers gathered at the ankle, worn beneath a shorter skirt. Critics howl that the divided garment is indecent because it outlines the legs and crotch area more clearly than a single skirt ever did, yet practicality wins. By 1910, bloomers or knickerbockers become standard for active women, and the old open-crotch drawers slowly give way to closed-crotch versions. For the first time since antiquity, women's underwear begins to hug the body rather than drape around it. The First World War, 1914–1918, accelerates everything. Millions of women enter factories and farms to replace men at the front. Heavy corsets prove impossible under overalls and work shirts. Brasiers, patented in various forms since the 1890s, but popularized by figures like Mary Phelps Jacob in 1914, replace corsets for many. Shorter skirts rise from ankle to mid-calf during the war years due to fabric rationing and safety around machinery. When peace returns in 1919, hemlines do not fall back. The 1920s flapper arrives, knee-length dresses, rolled stockings, cloche hats, and crucially, step-in chemises and brief knickers that cover the genitals with far less fabric than their mothers wore. Silk and rayon become affordable. Flesh-colored stockings make bare legs appear covered from a distance. The waist drops, then disappears. The boyish silhouette minimizes breasts and hips. For the first time in centuries, the female form is deliberately de-emphasized in fashionable dress, yet the genitals remain covered, now by sleek, minimal undergarments rather than voluminous petticoats. Men's fashion shifts more slowly but no less decisively. The lounge suit replaces the formal frock coat for daytime wear. Trousers become slimmer, jackets shorter. Underneath the heavy union suit, one-piece long underwear gives way to separate vest and drawers, then to short-style briefs by the late 1930s. Jockey introduced the Y-front brief in 1935, marketing it as masculine support and freedom of movement, the first mass-produced men's underwear designed specifically around the shape of the genitals rather than merely draping over them. The Great Depression, 1929–1939, paradoxically advances modesty in some ways and undermines it in others. Fabric shortages force shorter hems and simpler cuts, yet moral panic over indecent exposure leads to stricter enforcement of beach dress codes in many places. In the United States, police sometimes arrested women for wearing one-piece swimsuits without skirts. Men could be fined for swimming trunks shorter than mid-thigh. Hollywood's Hays Code, enforced rigorously after 1934, forbade visible navels, cleavage that dipped too low, or any suggestion of nudity below the waist, even in silhouette. Then comes the Second World War, 1939–1945, and fabric rationing returns with a vengeance. In Britain, the utility scheme limits yardage per garment. Women's skirts rise again, underwear shrinks. The United States sees the introduction of the two-piece bathing suit in 1946, named the Bikini after the Pacific atoll where atomic bombs were tested that year. Designer Louis Rayard's version used only 30 square inches of fabric and exposed the navel and much of the hip. He could find no professional model willing to wear it for the debut. A nude dancer named Micheline Bernardini stepped in. The bikini was banned from many beaches in Catholic countries and declared indecent by the Vatican, yet within a decade it would become a global symbol of post-war liberation. The 1950s attempt a brief return to full coverage. Dior's New Look, 1947, brings long skirts, nipped waists, and full petticoats back into fashion. Underwear follows, bullet bras, girdles, long line brasiers, and firm control panties that smooth and contain. Yet the bikini survives on European Riviera beaches and in California surf culture. By 1960, Bridget Bardot and Ursula Andress in Dr. No, 1962, make the bikini iconic. Men's swimwear shrinks from woolen full-body suits to brief trunks. Speedo-style racing briefs become acceptable for public pools. The sexual revolution of the late 1960s and 1970s shatters the last Victorian remnants. Mini-skirts rise to mid-thigh and higher. Pantyhose replace stockings and garter belts. String bikinis appear by 1974, reducing coverage to tiny triangles held by strings. Toplessness gains limited acceptance on European beaches. The United States, the brief, streaking fad of 1973-1974 sees thousands running naked through campuses and sporting events, often covering genitals with hands at the last moment, a gesture that acknowledges the persistence of modesty even in deliberate exposure. Underwear itself becomes fashion. Calvin Klein's 1982 men's brief campaign, featuring a near-naked Mark Wahlberg in Times Square billboards, turns men's underwear into a sexualized commodity. Women's thongs, introduced in the mid-1980s as a solution to visible panty lines under tight clothing, become mainstream by the 1990s. The visible thong trend of the late 1990s and early 2000s deliberately shows the waistband above low-rise jeans, a reversal of centuries of concealment. Decolonization and globalization complicate the picture. As African, Asian, and Caribbean nations gain independence in the 1950s-1970s, many newly sovereign governments initially promote Western dress as a marker of modernity. Yet cultural revival movements push back. In India, the 1960s see renewed pride in the sari and dhoti as symbols of national identity. In many African countries, leaders appear in traditional wrappers, dashikis, or agbada over modern underwear. Islamic revivalism, particularly after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, reintroduces stricter veiling and full-body covering in parts of the Middle East, South Asia, and beyond. The hijab, niqab, and burqa become potent symbols, both of religious devotion and of resistance to Western cultural hegemony. The late 20th and early 21st centuries produce a strange paradox. Unprecedented public exposure coexists with renewed insistence on covering. Reality television, social media, and pornography make naked or near-naked bodies instantly accessible to billions. Instagram influencers post bikini and lingerie photos to millions of followers. OnlyFans turns explicit content into income. At the same time, modest fashion becomes a multi-billion-dollar industry. Brands like Ahiyata, Verona Collection, and Haute Hijab offer stylish swimwear, sportswear, and everyday clothing that cover according to Islamic guidelines while following contemporary trends. In the West, modest fashion blogs and runways feature long sleeves, high necklines, and ankle-length hems as chic rather than repressive. Sports push boundaries. Beach volleyball's regulation bikinis, introduced in the 1990s, become controversial. Some players petition for longer shorts and shirts. In 2021, the Norwegian women's beach handball team is fined for wearing shorts instead of bikini bottoms during a European Championship match, sparking global debate over gender dress codes. Gymnasts, figure skaters, and swimmers wear increasingly streamlined, body-hugging suits that outline every contour while technically covering genitals. Transgender and non-binary individuals add new layers to the conversation. For many, choosing underwear becomes an intensely personal act of aligning body presentation with gender identity, boxers or briefs, bras or binders, thongs or boxers, with retailers responding by offering gender-neutral or explicitly trans-inclusive lines. Today, in 2026, the covering of private parts remains universal in almost every public context on Earth, yet the how, why, and how much vary wildly. A woman in Tehran wears a black chador that conceals everything except her face. A man in Tokyo wears boxer briefs beneath slim jeans. A teenager in Los Angeles posts a mirror selfie in a thong and crop top. An indigenous group in the Amazon still uses traditional cash sex for daily wear during ceremonies. Each choice carries echoes of that first African strip of hide: protection, status, identity, shame, desire, piety, rebellion. And so we arrive at the present moment. The history of covering private parts is not a straight line from nakedness to modesty, or from minimalism to elaboration, or from religious duty to secular fashion. It is a spiral, each turn revisiting the original impulse while adding new meanings. We still cover because our ancestors did, because biology left us vulnerable, because society demands boundaries, because desire needs mystery, because faith requires discipline, because individuality demands expression. What began as a practical response to thorns, cold, and insects has become the foundation of privacy, eroticism, hierarchy, morality, art, law, commerce, and identity. Every pair of underwear you own, every skirt you adjust, every time you feel fabric against your most intimate skin, you are participating in a decision made roughly 170,000 years ago on a sun-scorched plain, a decision that has never stopped evolving. This is the end of our journey through time, yet the story itself has no end. Tomorrow someone will tie, sew, design, or remove a covering in a way no one has before, and in that small act, the history of human modesty will write its next sentence. Thank you for traveling with us through these 10 parts, from the first tentative loincloth to the paradoxes of the present day. The covering of private parts is not merely clothing. It is one of the oldest, deepest, and most enduring ways we have defined what it means to be human. We now stand at the threshold of the present, March 2026, and look both backward and forward. The decision our ancestors made roughly 170,000 years ago to place a strip of hide between their legs has not reached any final form. It has only become more complex, more polarized, more visible, and in some ways more invisible than ever before. Today, the covering of private parts is simultaneously one of the most regulated, most commercialized, most politicized, and most quietly personal acts a human being performs. In this penultimate chapter, we examine how the ancient impulse has fractured into multiple, often contradictory modern realities, and where it may be heading in the decades ahead. The most immediately striking development of the last 15 years has been the explosive growth of the global modest fashion industry. What began in the mid-2000s as a niche response to demand from Muslim women in Western countries has become a multi-billion-dollar sector that now spans religions, cultures, and secular lifestyles. By 2025, estimates place the value of modest fashion, clothing designed to cover more skin than mainstream Western fashion norms, at between USD 300–400 billion annually, with projections reaching $500 billion by the early 2030s. Brands such as Verona Collection, Ab Inaya Haute Hijab, The Modest before its closure, Modernissa, and emerging players like Ahieta, Cynthia Rowley's Modest swim line, and even collaborations between Nike and hijabi athletes have turned long sleeves, high necklines, loose trousers, maxi skirts, and full coverage swimwear into high fashion statements rather than concessions to tradition. This is not merely a religious phenomenon. While Islamic modest wear remains the largest segment, bikinis, jilbabs, abayas, and stylish hijabs that coordinate with streetwear, the market now includes Orthodox Jewish tzniut lines, conservative Christian purity fashion, and a growing secular modest movement driven by people who cite comfort, sun protection, sensory issues, body image concerns, or simple aesthetic preference. In East Asia, particularly South Korea and Japan, covered core and quiet luxury modest aesthetics have appeared on TikTok and Instagram, featuring layered long skirts, wide-leg trousers, and high-neck blouses even among non-religious Gen Z consumers. In Western Europe and North America, the body positivity movement has intersected with modest fashion. Many plus-size influencers promote long dresses and palazzo pants not because of religious obligation, but because they feel more confident when less skin is exposed to public scrutiny and photographic judgment. At the same time, the opposite trend has never been stronger. Social media platforms have normalized levels of exposure that would have been unthinkable even in the sexually liberated 1970s. Instagram Reels, TikTok fit checks, and OnlyFans-style content routinely show underwear waistbands, visible thongs above low-rise jeans, micro-bikinis, sheer dresses with no visible undergarments, and intentional flashes of skin that stop just short of legal definitions of nudity in most jurisdictions. The paradox is stark. Never before have so many people voluntarily displayed so much of their bodies in public digital spaces while, in physical public spaces, covering remains near universal. The genitals themselves are almost never shown uncensored on mainstream platforms. Meta, TikTok, and YouTube still enforce strict policies, yet the shape, outline, and suggestion of them have become part of everyday visual language for hundreds of millions of users. This digital hyperexposure has produced its own counter-reactions. Modest talk and covered girl summer trends celebrate full coverage as empowering rather than repressive. Some creators argue that choosing to cover more skin reclaims agency from a culture that demands constant sexual availability. Others frame it as resistance to over-sexualization. Climate-aware dressing, long loose clothing protects against UV rays and heat better than minimal coverage in many environments, or simply aesthetic preference in an era of fast fashion burnout. Meanwhile, Free the Nipple campaigns and occasional pushes to decriminalize toplessness for women in public, successful in some U.S. states and parts of Canada and Europe, highlight the continuing gender asymmetry. Male chests remain uncontroversial while female chests, and especially female genitals, carry vastly heavier cultural freight. Gender debates have become central to the contemporary story of covering. Transgender individuals often describe underwear as one of the most emotionally charged items in their wardrobe. For many trans women, the first time wearing women's briefs or panties can feel like a profound affirmation of identity. For trans men, boxers or compression shorts can be a daily step toward bodily congruence. Non-binary people have driven demand for gender-neutral underwear lines. Brands like Tomboyx, GC2B, Binders, Woxer, and Parade offer cuts and styles marketed without binary assumptions. At the same time, some radical feminist voices argue that all gendered underwear reinforces patriarchal control over bodies, while others defend traditionally feminine lingerie as a source of personal pleasure and power. Religious revivalism has added further layers. Since the early 2010s, stricter interpretations of Islamic dress have gained visibility in many Muslim-majority countries and diaspora communities. In Afghanistan, after the Taliban's 2021 return, mandatory full-body covering, chadri/burqa, was reimposed. In parts of northern Nigeria, Indonesia's Aceh province, and certain Indian states with rising Hindutva influence, local ordinances have attempted to enforce longer hems or head coverings for women in public institutions. Conversely, reformist and progressive Muslim voices, especially younger women in Malaysia, Indonesia, Turkey, and Western Europe, have popularized hijab styling that combines faith-based coverage with contemporary cuts, bright colors, and athletic wear. The tension between individual choice and communal expectation remains acute. Climate change is quietly reshaping the conversation in ways few foresaw. In regions facing longer, hotter summers, South Asia, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Europe, the American Southwest, loose, long, light-colored clothing often proves more practical than minimal Western-style coverage. Loose abayas, thobes, kurtas, and linen maxi dresses wick sweat, provide shade, and reduce sunburn risk far better than tank tops and shorts in 45°C heat. As global temperatures rise, public health campaigns in some countries now recommend cultural appropriate full coverage as a heat illness prevention strategy. In this sense, the Neolithic shift toward more enveloping garments in settled agricultural societies may find an unexpected echo in the Anthropocene. Technology is accelerating change at both ends of the spectrum. Smart fabrics that regulate temperature, wick moisture, and offer UV protection are making full coverage clothing more comfortable than ever. 3D printed and laser-cut lingerie allows for previously impossible levels of customization and minimalism while still technically covering genitals. Virtual reality and the metaverse introduce entirely new questions. If your avatar can appear nude while your physical body remains clothed, does modesty still apply? Early experiments in platforms like VR chat already show users choosing hyper-sexualized skins alongside others who insist on fully dressed avatars even in adult-only spaces. Looking forward, several trajectories seem plausible. One is continued polarization, a world in which some communities tighten covering requirements, religious, cultural, or climate-driven, while others push toward ever greater exposure in digital and select physical spaces. Another is convergence around hybrid norms, athleisure-inspired modest where that covers more skin yet feels modern and empowering, combined with underwear that becomes increasingly individualized and less visible in daily life. A third possibility is fragmentation by generation and geography. Gen Alpha and Gen Beta, growing up with omnipresent cameras, may develop entirely new instincts about what should and should not be covered, influenced more by algorithm-driven trends than by traditional religious or parental authority. Whatever path emerges, the original impulse remains. We cover our private parts because our bodies are still vulnerable in ways no other animals are. We cover them because society still needs boundaries between public and private, between self and other. We cover them because desire still thrives on partial concealment, because faith still seeks markers of devotion, because identity still finds expression through fabric choices, and because, after nearly 200 millennia, the simple act of placing something between our legs and the eyes of the world continues to feel necessary, meaningful, and inescapably human. In the final part, we will draw the entire arc together, returning to that African savanna, reflecting on what the journey reveals about human nature itself, and asking the one question that has never received a final answer. Why, after all this time, do we still feel the need to cover? Returning to that African savanna, reflecting on what the journey reveals about human nature itself, and asking the one question that has never received a final answer. Why, after all this time, do we still feel the need to cover? Picture once more that open grassland in East Africa, perhaps somewhere near the Great Rift Valley, some 170,000 years ago. The sun is high, the air dry and shimmering. A small band of early Homo sapiens, 20 or 30 individuals, moves across the landscape in search of water and game. Their bodies are lined, dark-skinned, almost entirely hairless except for the crown of the head and the small patches under arms and between legs where scent still lingers. They walk upright, genitals exposed in a way no quadruped ancestor ever experienced. A young man, perhaps in his early 20s, has just killed a small antelope with a thrown stone. As the group gathers to butcher the carcass, he notices a sharp thorn bush nearby. He has been scratched before, painful welts across thighs and scrotum that swelled, festered, slowed him for days. This time he pauses. He takes a fresh strip of the antelope's hide, still warm and bloody, scrapes it quickly with a flake of obsidian, chews the edges until they soften, then passes the narrow band between his legs and ties it at his hips with a twist of sinew. The front flap hangs just low enough to shield what needs shielding. He stands, adjusts, feels the difference, less vulnerability, less distraction, more focus on the task ahead. The others watch, some nod. A woman nearby does the same with a smaller piece for herself. No words are needed. The act is practical, obvious, immediate. It spreads through imitation, not decree. That single, unrecorded moment was not the invention of shame. It was not yet the birth of modesty as we understand it. It was a tool, a very small, very simple tool, that addressed a very specific problem created by two earlier evolutionary leaps: the loss of body hair for better thermoregulation, and bipedalism that thrust the reproductive organs forward into harm's way. Everything that followed, every shenty, copina, subligaculum, braise, drawers, briefs, thong, bikini, boxer, cash sex, fundoshi, maxtladdle, dhoti, jockstrap, panty, G-string, was built upon that first pragmatic decision. The covering of private parts began as protection. Only later did it become meaning. Over the next 2 hours of this narration, we have followed that meaning as it ramified across time and space. We watched it travel with migrating bands out of Africa, adapting to ice and jungle, absorbing beads and dyes and status. We saw it harden into social expectation in the first farming villages, where strangers appeared and reputation mattered more than kinship. We traced its codification into hierarchies of power in Bronze Age cities, longer hems for kings, coarser cloth for laborers, white linen for priests. We followed it into classical philosophies where Greeks celebrated the heroic nude in the gymnasium yet demanded everyday concealment, where Romans wrote indecency into law, where Confucian propriety and Vedic Dharma both made covering a visible index of virtue. We entered the age of revealed religions, where Genesis turned fig leaves into a theological archetype, where the Qur'an commanded guarding of the furuj, where monastic rules and sumptuary laws policed the body in the name of divine order. We crossed into the colonial era, where European missionaries and planters forced trousers and shifts onto indigenous peoples as the first step of civilizing, while enslaved Africans turned scraps of cloth into quiet assertions of dignity. We arrived in the industrial and modern world, where factories made underwear cheap and universal, where hemlines rose and fell with wars and liberation movements, where the bikini shocked one generation and became normal for the next, where digital screens now broadcast near-naked bodies to billions, while modest fashion becomes a global luxury market. Through every stage, the original function never entirely disappeared. Even in air-conditioned offices and heated homes, underwear still protects against chafing, sweat, accidental exposure. Even in the hottest climates, loose full-length garments often prove more comfortable than minimal coverage. The biological vulnerability that prompted the first loincloth, skin without fur, genitals forward and pendulous, remains unchanged. What has changed, again and again, is the meaning we have layered on top of that biology. We cover because we are ashamed, or so many traditions insist. Yet shame is not universal, it is learned. In some hunter-gatherer societies documented in the ethnographic record, Hadza, Kung, certain Amazonian groups, adults routinely go naked or near naked in camp without apparent embarrassment, yet still use minimal genital coverings when hunting or traveling through thorny terrain. Shame arrives with density, with strangers, with property, with inheritance, with moral systems that link genitals to sin or pollution. The fig leaf moment in Eden is not the discovery of nakedness. It is the discovery that nakedness can be judged. We cover because we desire, or rather, because desire is more powerful when partially obstructed. The loincloth creates mystery where nudity offers none. A glimpse beneath a skirt, the outline beneath tight fabric, the suggestion of what lies hidden, all of these ignite imagination in ways full exposure rarely does. Eroticism is born in the gap between seen and unseen. Every culture that has elaborated clothing beyond mere protection has understood this, whether in the transparent silks of Hellenistic queens, the clinging drapery of Indian temple sculpture, the low-cut bodices of Renaissance courts, or the deliberate waistband reveals of early 2000s low-rise fashion. Covering does not suppress sexuality, it channels and amplifies it. We cover because society demands boundaries. The private parts are where biology meets continuity, where new humans are conceived, born, and in many traditions, where life's most intimate fluids flow. To expose them casually is to erase the line between individual and group, between self and other. Every major civilization has used genital covering to mark who belongs and who does not, who is adult and who is child, who is sacred and who is profane, who is master and who is servant. When empires collide, Greek and Persian, Roman and barbarian, Christian and Muslim, colonial and indigenous, the first visible difference is often how much skin is covered and how. Clothing becomes shorthand for civilization itself. We cover because power is written on the body. Kings wear longer, richer, more elaborate versions of the same basic garment their subjects wear. Priests veil themselves in white or black to signify separation from the carnal. Women in many societies have been required to cover more comprehensively than men, not always because of biology, but because controlling female sexuality has so often been tied to property, lineage, and social order. Even in ostensibly egalitarian movements, gendered covering persists. Sports federations still debate bikini bottoms versus shorts. Schools enforce skirt lengths more stringently for girls. Workplaces quietly judge women more harshly for inappropriate exposure. We cover because faith requires visible discipline. From monastic robes to hijabs, tzitzit fringes to Amish plain dress, the choice to cover more than is strictly necessary signals submission to something larger than the self. In an age of individualism, modest fashion has paradoxically become one of the clearest ways some people proclaim community and transcendence, and yet we also cover because we are free to choose otherwise. The same technology that makes micro bikinis and sheer mesh dresses possible also makes elegant full-coverage abayas and temperature-regulating athleisure possible. The same platforms that host explicit content host millions of users proudly declaring that they feel most empowered when most covered. The ancient impulse has not been erased by modernity, it has multiplied. So why do we still feel the need? Because we are still the same creature who first felt a thorn's sting and decided this part of me must be guarded. Because our bodies remain soft, hairless, upright, vulnerable in ways no other animals are. Because the mind that invented tools also invented meaning, and we cannot help but pour meaning into the things closest to our skin. Because every time we adjust a waistband, smooth a skirt, pull up a zipper, or tie a knot, we are enacting a ritual that connects us backward through every ancestor to that first pragmatic gesture on the savanna, and forward to whatever strange, hybrid coverings our descendants will invent in a warmer, more connected, more augmented future. The history of covering private parts is therefore not a history of clothing alone. It is a history of becoming human, of turning accident into intention, vulnerability into virtue, exposure into elegance, silence into symbol. It is the longest, quietest conversation our species has ever had with itself about where the self ends and the world begins. We have reached the end of this 10-part journey. From the lice that betrayed the date, through the bone tools of Morocco, the beads of saddle Huryuk, the shenty of pharaohs, the perizoma of athletes, the subligaculum of legionaries, the fig leaves of Eden, the veils of Medina, the loincloths of plantations, the briefs of billboards, the bikinis of beaches, and the thongs of timelines, we have followed one continuous thread. Thank you for staying with us through every chapter, every century, every shift in meaning. This history is yours as much as it is ours. Please let us know in the comments, where are you watching this history video from and what time is it where you are right now? Drop your city or town, your country, the exact time on your clock. We love seeing how far this story has traveled. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of humanity's oldest and strangest habits, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more long-form history documentaries that go beneath the surface of the everyday. Hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Until then, adjust your clothing if you need to, and remember, every time you do, you're touching 170,000 years of human ingenuity, vulnerability, and meaning. This is the end, but the story, of course, continues.